What would you do if your last piece of food could save a stranger, but also get you killed? That was the choice one cowboy faced on the frozen plains, and when he chose kindness, he woke up to 300 Comanche warriors surrounding his ranch. The winter of 1873 wasn't gentle to anyone in the Texas frontier. The wind cut through coats like knives, and the land was as white and empty as a bleached skull. Cowboys weren't kings out here. They were survivors, hanging on by grit, prayer, and whatever scraps they could carry in their saddlebags. Luke Callahan was one of those cowboys, 30 years old, wiry as a fence post, a man who'd lived more nights under the stars than under a roof. He had one horse, one saddlebag, and inside it, half a loaf of stale bread. That was his dinner. That was his breakfast. That was survival. He made camp by a creek that night, snow crunching under his boots. As he scraped together kindling, he heard it, faint at first, almost swallowed by the wind. A cry. High, thin, fragile. Luke froze, tilting his head. Could have been the wind, or could have been something else. Out here, you didn't ignore sounds. They could save your life, or end it. Lantern in hand, he followed the noise through the trees. His boots sank into snow with every step, each crunch echoing louder than his own heartbeat. And then he saw her. A girl. No older than 12, curled up like a wounded bird, wrapped in torn scraps of deerskin. Frost clung to her lashes, her lips blue, her breathing shallow. A Comanche girl. Her eyes flickered open, dark, glassy, desperate. She looked at him, not with fear, but with something worse, resignation. Like she'd already accepted death. Luke swallowed hard. He knew what this meant. Helping her could bring trouble, maybe deadly trouble. Comanches didn't take kindly to strangers meddling in their affairs. And a lone cowboy? He was nothing but a trespasser on their land. But he also knew one thing. He couldn't just walk away. He dropped to his knees, pulled off his gloves, and fished inside his saddlebag. His fingers touched the bread. Hard as stone, barely edible, but it was all he had left. He hesitated for a second. One bite meant the difference between strength tomorrow or weakness. But he broke it anyway, snapping off a chunk, pressing it to the girl's lips. "Eat, little one," he whispered. "Eat." Her mouth opened. She chewed slow, painfully slow, and then, like a spark catching dry grass, the life came back into her eyes. A flicker, a glow. Enough. Luke wrapped her in his coat, teeth chattering as he pressed her close to his chest. He built the fire higher, feeding it with every scrap of wood he had. Through the long, bitter night, he held her, warming her hands, whispering nonsense just so she'd hear a voice. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But as dawn painted the horizon pink and gold, he knew one thing. She was still alive. And because of that choice, because he gave his last bread, his life was about to turn upside down. Here's the twist. This wasn't just any Comanche girl. She was the daughter of a respected chief. And when a Comanche chief owes a debt, the whole tribe knows about it. By the time Luke got her to safety, word had already started spreading. Riders carried it across the campfires. Whispers spread like wildfire. And as Luke trudged back toward his small ranch, stomach empty, body aching, he couldn't shake the feeling he was being watched. He thought he was alone. He thought the hardest part was over. But little did he know, this was only the beginning. Because the kindness he showed that night was about to echo across the plains. And the echo would come back with the thunder of 300 hooves, shaking the earth beneath his ranch. And when those riders came into view, lined up in a wall of spears and painted faces, Luke realized one piece of bread had bought him the biggest debt of his life. Luke thought the hardest part was over. He'd made it through the night, kept the girl alive, and the sun was rising warm enough to chase back the frostbite that threatened her fingers. He figured he'd done his good deed and that was the end of it. But if the frontier had a rule, it was this: nothing ends clean. The girl barely spoke, just one word repeated again and again in a trembling voice. Luke couldn't make it out at first, but by mid-morning, he realized she was whispering her father's name. a name carried like thunder across the Comanche camps. Now here's the thing about the Comanche. They didn't just let things slide. Blood debts, kindness, betrayal. It all rippled through the tribe like a stone dropped in still water. And Luke had just tossed in a boulder. By the time he saddled his horse and rode the girl toward shelter, he already felt the eyes on him. You ever get that chill in your spine when you know you're being watched? That's what rode with him mile after mile. The trees seemed too still. The wind carried whispers that didn't belong to the wind. He spotted hoof prints before he saw the riders. Fresh ones, dozens of them. Deep cuts in the snow where ponies had passed only hours earlier. His hand tightened on the reins. He wasn't a fool. He knew the Comanche had found them, and that meant one thing. They knew what he had done. Luke wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a death sentence. The girl clung to him as he rode, her small frame shaking with cold and hunger. Every few minutes she'd glance over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to be there. Maybe she already knew what was coming. Maybe she knew her people never left their own behind. By late afternoon, the sky turned the color of steel, heavy with another storm. Luke pushed the horse hard, hoping to reach his small cabin before nightfall. But the closer he got, the louder that silence felt. And then he saw it. Smoke. Not from his chimney. He was still a mile away from home. This smoke came from the ridgeline. Thin trails rising in columns, too many to count. At first he thought maybe it was a grass fire, but no, it was the smoke of campfires. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Luke's stomach knotted. He knew what that meant. The Comanche weren't just watching. They were gathering. Every instinct screamed at him to ride faster, to disappear into the canyons, to hide. But he couldn't. Not with the girl slumped against him, too weak to hold on much longer. If he abandoned her now, all he'd done would mean nothing. So he kept riding. By the time he reached his cabin, night was creeping in again. He carried the girl inside, laid her by the fire, and fed her the last of his scraps. Nothing more than crumbs. She fell asleep almost instantly, her breathing steadier now. For the first time, Luke allowed himself a sliver of relief. But then, he heard it. The distant rhythm. Slow, steady, like the beating of a war drum. At first he thought it was the storm rolling in, but storms don't come with hoofbeats. He stepped outside. The air was sharp, freezing, but it wasn't the cold that made him shiver. Out across the snow, the horizon was moving. Dark shapes gliding in and out of the moonlight. Riders, scores of them, maybe hundreds. Luke stood there, frozen in the doorway, watching as the shapes grew clearer. Painted faces, spears tipped with iron, feathers dancing in the wind. 300 Comanche warriors, fanned out like a great shadow across the plain, moving as one. His first thought was simple. I'm a dead man, because out here, 300 against one wasn't a fight. It was an execution. But then another thought crept in, one that made his chest tighten. Maybe, just maybe, they hadn't come for blood. Maybe they'd come for the girl. And if that was true, then saving her wasn't just an act of mercy. It was a bond, a tie between him and the tribe that he hadn't asked for, but now carried. Still, bonds don't always bring peace. Sometimes they bring trials. Luke gripped the doorway, heart hammering, as the riders drew closer. He thought about reaching for his rifle, but he knew how foolish that would be. A single shot wouldn't stop 300. All it would do is seal his fate. So he waited. Waited as the thunder of hooves shook the earth. Waited as the war cries pierced the night. Waited as the girl stirred inside, whispering her father's name again in her sleep. And when the riders finally formed a wall before his cabin, stretching as far as his eyes could see, Luke realized his life wasn't just his own anymore. The bread he gave had bought him survival for her. But what it cost him, well, he was about to find out. Luke stood in the doorway of his cabin, hands empty, heart pounding so loud he swore the Comanche could hear it. 300 warriors sat on their ponies, silent as stone. The air was thick with frost and tension. Their eyes were fixed on him, hard and unblinking. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the nervous shuffle of his horse in the corral and the faint crackle of firewood inside. Then the line of riders split. Out rode a single figure. He wasn't young, but he wasn't frail either. His hair was long, streaked with gray, braided and tied with strips of red cloth. His chest was bare despite the cold, scars running across it like maps of old battles. In his hand he carried a spear decorated with eagle feathers. Luke knew immediately. This was the chief. The man stopped just a few yards away, his pony snorting clouds of steam in the frigid air. His gaze was sharp but not reckless. This was a leader who measured before he struck. Luke swallowed. His rifle leaned against the wall inside, but he didn't dare touch it. Raising a weapon now would be suicide. So he raised his hands instead, palms open, showing he had nothing to hide. The chief didn't speak English. At least Luke didn't think he did. But the silence between them carried a language all its own. And then from inside the cabin, a small voice broke that silence. "Father." Luke turned. The girl was awake, pale, weak, but standing in the doorway now, his coat still draped over her shoulders. Her eyes locked on the chief's, and suddenly the weight of everything fell into place. She wasn't just any girl. She was his daughter. The reaction was instant. A ripple moved through the warriors like a wave crashing on the shore. Some leaned forward on their ponies, others raised their spears, voices murmuring sharp and low. To them, Luke wasn't a cowboy anymore. He was a stranger who had touched their chief's blood, carried her, fed her, saved her. That could mean honor, or it could mean desecration. The chief dismounted slowly. He walked toward Luke, every step deliberate. His shadow stretched long in the moonlight. Luke's stomach knotted tighter with each footfall. When the chief stopped, he looked down at his daughter, then at the cowboy. His face was unreadable. Finally he spoke, his voice deep, commanding, a language Luke barely understood. But he understood enough. The chief was asking, why? Why did you feed her? Why did you save her? Why risk your life for her? Luke licked his lips, dry and cracked. He had no perfect words, no way to explain the gnawing hunger that told him to keep the bread for himself, and the stronger pull that told him to give it away. So he did the only thing he could. He touched his chest with a flat palm, then pointed at the girl. "Bread," he said softly. She needed it more. The chief studied him. His eyes narrowed. Then slowly, he nodded once. But the warriors didn't seem convinced. Murmurs rose again, louder this time, sharp as arrows. Luke caught fragments, words he didn't know but tones he understood. Accusation, distrust. Some wanted him punished, maybe killed. The chief raised his hand, silencing them. He barked a command, and two warriors rode forward. Luke stiffened, but the men ignored him. Instead, they lifted the girl gently from the doorway and carried her toward the line of horses. She didn't fight them. She only looked back at Luke, her eyes wide, filled with something between fear and gratitude. And just like that, she was gone. Luke's chest felt hollow. He told himself it was relief, that she was safe now, back with her people. But another part of him whispered that it wasn't over. Not yet. The chief lingered a moment longer. He stepped closer, until Luke could see the scars across his face, the lines etched deep from years of war and loss. The man raised his spear, and for one terrifying second, Luke thought it was the end. But instead, the chief turned the spear sideways and pressed the shaft against Luke's chest. Not a killing blow, a gesture, a mark. And then he spoke again, this time in rough English. "Oh, that was it. 2 words, heavy as the mountains, sharp as a blade." Then he turned, mounted his pony, and rode back to his warriors. In a wave they followed him, hooves pounding the earth until the night swallowed them whole. Luke stood there alone again, breath ragged in the frozen air. Those 2 words echoing in his skull. "You owe." He had no idea what the debt would be, but deep down he knew this wasn't mercy. This was a summons, and sooner or later the Comanche would return. Not for bread this time, but for something far greater. For days after that night, Luke couldn't shake the sound of those 2 words. UO. They followed him like ghosts. Every time he stepped outside, he half expected to see those riders lined up again, waiting for him. When he worked the corral, when he chopped wood, even when he tried to sleep, he heard it. UO. At first, nothing happened. The land went quiet again, just the usual rhythm of frontier life. Feeding the horse, mending fences, praying the storm clouds would pass him by. And Luke almost convinced himself it had been nothing more than a warning. A way for the chief to say, "Stay out of our business, cowboy." But then, on the seventh night, the Comanche returned. This time it wasn't 300, just 10 riders, shadows sliding silently across the moonlit plain. Luke spotted them before they reached the cabin. They didn't come with war cries or painted faces. They came like men on a mission, and leading them was the chief. Luke stepped out to meet them, rifle slung across his shoulder but hands loose at his sides. He wasn't stupid enough to aim it. He stood still as they approached, his breath fogging in the night air. The chief dismounted and walked right up to him, eyes steady, voice low. "You come," that was it. No threat, no explanation, just a command. Luke hesitated. He glanced back at his cabin. The fire still glowed inside. His bedroll was waiting, his small stash of supplies, his little slice of peace. If he said no, maybe they'd ride away. But maybe they'd burn it all down. Maybe they'd cut him down where he stood. So he nodded once. "All right," he muttered. "I'll come." The chief's men gave him a pony, smaller than his horse but quick-footed. Luke climbed on, gripping the reins, and with that, they rode out into the night. Hours passed in silence, the kind of silence that hums in your ears and makes you wonder if the men beside you can hear your heartbeat. Finally, as the horizon began to gray with the first light of dawn, they reached the Comanche camp. Luke had seen camps before, small clusters of lodges, maybe a dozen families. This was something else entirely. Dozens of teepees stretched across the plain, smoke curling from their tops, dogs barking, children darting between fires, and the smell of roasted meat drifted through the cold morning air. But the mood wasn't festive. It was tense. Men gathered as Luke was led through the camp, their faces hard, eyes suspicious. Women pulled their children closer. He was the outsider, the cowboy, the trespasser. The chief led him to the center, where a great fire burned brighter than the rest. Warriors stood in a circle, waiting. The chief raised his hand, and the murmurs died down. He looked at Luke, then at the crowd, and spoke in Comanche. Luke couldn't understand the words, but he understood the weight. This was judgment. This was the moment where they decided what that debt meant. The chief turned back to Luke and in rough English laid it out. "You feed my daughter. You save her life. Now you show your courage." Luke's stomach twisted. "How?" he asked. The chief pointed. 2 warriors stepped forward, dragging a buffalo hide. On it lay a young man, wounded badly, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Blood stained the hide and his face was pale. The chief's eyes locked on Luke. "You fix." Luke blinked. "I'm no doctor," but the warriors shoved the hide closer. The man groaned, a sound that clawed at Luke's chest. He recognized the look, the same look he'd seen in the girl's eyes. The edge of death. Luke's hands shook. He'd patched men up before. Bar fights, cattle accidents. But this was no small cut. This was a life hanging by a thread, and 300 pairs of eyes were waiting to see if the cowboy who gave bread could now give more. He took a deep breath, wiped his palms on his coat, and knelt by the wounded man. The injury was a spear wound, deep but clean. Infection was the enemy here. Luke did what he could, cleaned it with whiskey from his saddlebag, pressed strips of cloth tight against the bleeding, whispered prayers under his breath as he worked. The wounded man writhed, groaning, but he held on. Minutes dragged into an hour. Sweat stung Luke's eyes, even in the cold air. He pressed, stitched, and bound. Every movement clumsy but desperate. And finally, the bleeding slowed. The man's breathing evened. He wasn't healed, not by a long shot. But he was alive, alive enough to see another sunrise. Luke sat back, exhausted, hands red and trembling. He looked up at the chief. For the first time, the old man's expression softened. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. The crowd murmured, not with anger this time, but with something else. Respect. The chief stepped forward, placed a hand on Luke's shoulder, and spoke again. Debt. Smaller. Luke almost laughed. Almost. But the weight in the chief's eyes told him the truth. The debt wasn't gone. It had only shifted. He had proven courage, yes, but courage was only the beginning. Luke thought maybe that was it. He'd saved the chief's daughter, he'd saved a wounded warrior, and he figured the ledger was balanced. Debt paid, clean slate. But that's not how the frontier worked, and it sure wasn't how the Comanche worked. For 3 days he stayed in the camp. He was fed, watched closely, treated with wary respect, but never trust. Children peeked at him from behind their mothers, laughing at the strange cowboy who chewed jerky too slow. Warriors eyed him like a wolf who had wandered into their herd, dangerous, tolerated, but never welcome. On the 4th day, the chief called for him. Luke followed, his boots crunching through the frost as they walked to the edge of the camp. There, the land opened wide, stretching into the horizon where the sky met the plains. The chief stood tall, his daughter beside him, pale but strong now. He turned to Luke and spoke in English, words broken but clear enough. You give bread, you give courage, now you give choice. Luke frowned. Choice? The chief gestured to the horizon. Land, that word hit Luke like a hammer. Land, the thing every man out here wanted, fought for, bled for. To a cowboy, land was more than dirt. It was freedom, it was roots, it was survival. The chief's eyes narrowed. Your ranch, small, but yours. He pointed toward the distant ridge where Luke's cabin stood, lonely against the sky. Comanche wanted safe, no blue coats, no settlers. You keep it that way. Luke's throat went dry. It wasn't just a request, it was a command. The Comanche didn't want his land for themselves. They wanted a buffer, a shield. A cowboy who would stand between them and the endless tide of settlers that poured west every year. It made a twisted kind of sense. Luke had nothing but a patch of earth and the grit to survive on it. But to the Comanche, that patch could be more than a ranch. It could be a line in the sand. The chief stepped closer, his face carved from stone. You stay, you watch, you warn. Luke looked at the girl, at the way she clutched her father's hand. She was alive because of him. The wounded warrior was alive because of him. And now the chief was telling him the truth, plain and simple. You're tied to us now. Luke could have refused. He could have ridden off, vanished into the canyons, started over somewhere far from Comanche country. But he knew what that would mean. It would mean breaking the bond he'd forged in bread, in blood, in firelight. And deep down, he also knew he'd never outrun it. So he nodded slowly. I'll stay. The chief's eyes softened for the briefest moment. He lifted his spear, pressed it once more against Luke's chest, this time not as a threat, but as a seal. A mark of agreement. The circle was complete. Luke rode back to his cabin days later, alone again, but not truly alone. The horizon felt different now. Every shadow in the trees, every rider in the distance, it all reminded him that he wasn't just Luke Callahan, cowboy anymore. He was a man with a debt, a man with a duty. And in the seasons that followed, the Comanche held true to their end. They didn't raid his cattle, they didn't torch his fences. Now and then a rider would appear at the edge of his land, silent and watchful, and then vanish again. A reminder, a promise. Neighbors wondered why Luke's ranch never got hit when others did. They called it luck. Luke never corrected them. He just kept to himself, fixing fences, breaking horses, and keeping one eye always on the horizon. Because he knew the truth. He wasn't spared by luck. He was spared by bread. One night, years later, as he sat by the fire with a pot of beans simmering, he thought back to that frozen evening, the girl in the snow, the last crust of bread, the thunder of hooves outside his cabin, and those 2 words that had changed everything. You owe. Luke smiled faintly, shaking his head. Maybe he still owed. Maybe he always would. But in a land as wild and unforgiving as the frontier, owing wasn't always a curse. Sometimes it was the only thing that kept you alive. And so the cowboy lived on, a man caught between two worlds, carrying a debt written not on paper, but in kindness, courage, and a single piece of bread that echoed across the plains. And that's the story of how one cowboy's last crust of bread brought 300 warriors to his doorstep and changed the course of his life forever. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the smallest choices carry the heaviest weight. And if you enjoyed riding along through this tale, you'll want to stick around. I've got plenty more stories from the old frontier where kindness, courage, and consequence ride side by side. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like if it kept you hooked, and drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in Luke's boots? I'll see you in the next story, partner. Until then, keep your fire burning, keep your coffee hot, and never underestimate the power of a single piece of bread.